So we've talked quite a lot about both acute and chronic stress at this point. We've compared and contrasted them. We've talked about their good points and their bad points. We've talked about their effects on the body. And we've talked about the underlying mechanisms that lead to those effects on the body. Now, in doing so, we've constantly acknowledged that people experience stress differently, but we've sort of ignored that and pushed it to the side, and we've been speaking more in generalities than anything else. For instance, we've spoken about acute stress as being pretty universally adaptive and as having a fairly consistent and core set of characteristics and effects on the body. Similarly, we've spoken about chronic stress as being pretty universally maladaptive and as having another set of consistent and core characteristics and effects on the body. Now, discussing acute and chronic stress this way has been both necessary and appropriate to this point in order to introduce the topics, but it does ignore the large variation that we see between people in terms of their stress reactivity, their stress tolerance, their engagement in specific coping mechanisms, and the effectiveness of those coping mechanisms for different individuals. And so for the next two modules, we're going to be taking a much more individual differences approach and be looking at some of the factors that lead one person to experience stress a little bit differently than another. Now, those factors can be either internal or external. Internal factors are factors that have to do with the individual, your personality, your level of optimism, your approach versus avoidance tendencies, your willingness to engage in specific coping mechanisms. Your external factors, in contrast, are factors that are outside of you, that are more related to your environment, to the city in which you live, to your socioeconomic status, your access to mental health resources, your social support networks. Now, both internal and external factors have significant influence over shaping who we are as individuals. And in the case of stress, in terms of shaping our own personal relationship with stress management, and stress health. In addition, there's emerging work coming out suggesting important interactions between internal and external factors, which we'll talk about next class. For now, for this lesson, what I'd like to do is, before delving deeply into the specific factors that lead one person to experience stress differently than another, I'd like to have a slightly more general discussion about the study of individual differences in general. Because I find that when we start talking about internal and external factors, about personality versus the environment, that students invariably have questions about nature versus nurture, about biology versus environment. And so the way I like to think about individual differences, and it doesn't matter which individual difference we're talking about, but it might as well be stress reactivity for our purposes. The way I like to think about it is to place that individual difference, stress reactivity, on a spectrum from 1 to 10. And each of us is born with a tendency, with some biological predisposition that places us somewhere on this scale from 1 to 10, and that also provides some restrictions in terms of the range in which we may be able to fall on this scale at any point in our life. So, for instance, we might as well use me as an example. Let's say that I was born with a tendency, with a biological predisposition to be reasonably low in stress reactivity. Let's say I'm a 5 out of 10 in stress reactivity, and that's probably pretty accurate. So we'll place me on 5 out of 10 on the spectrum from 1 to 10 on stress reactivity. Does that mean I'm going to be a 5 out of 10 all my life? No, because I have the ability to change over time, and because the environment is also going to exude influence on me over time. And so, for instance, if I were to have fantastic parents, an enriched environment, I go to a good school, and I also have high motivation to improve myself and to engage in effective coping mechanisms and stress management, then I may find that I have the capacity to move myself to a 3 out of 10 over time. I may never be a 1 out of 10. My biological predispositions may not ever allow me to be a 1 out of 10, but I may be able to shift myself over to a 3 out of 10 with, certain favorable environmental and personal influences. Similarly, or oppositely, if I have terrible parents who abuse me or neglect me, or I end up in a traumatic car accident that really influences me as a child, or sexual assault as an adult, then I may end up with an unfavorable life influences that shift me over as far as an 8 out of 10. On the scale. Now, again, I may never end up a 10 out of 10. My own biological predispositions may limit the extent to which I can, stray on within my range. But within a 3 to 8 range, environmental influences may play a very important role. So, we're all born with some biological predisposition. One of you is born a 3 out of 10 on stress reactivity. One of you is born a 7 out of 10. That does provide some initial starting point, but you do have a range. You can change and you can improve or regress over time. And the goal is to harness your motivation, to harness your coping skills, and to, hopefully have a certain amount of environmental luck along the way that can help you to become the best stress coper you can be within your own biological restrictions and limits.